Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The soft hum of a ceiling fan sliced through the quiet in the sitting room, stirring the curtains like ghosts rehearsing a dance. Adeora sat curled on the far end of the floral settee, her knees drawn to her chest as the smell of fried plantain drifted from the kitchen and wrapped around the house like a familiar lullaby. From a corner, Greg's voice thundered, low but firm, like a judge handing down a verdict even before the trial began. I said no, Adeora. That boy doesn't look like someone who knows where he's going. His words weren't new. They hung in the air like old cobwebs, spun out of habit and suspicion. She didn't argue. She never did. Not because she didn't have words, but because her words often fell to the floor like broken chalk, white, scattered, and quickly swept away. Outside, the sun cast long shadows through the iron bars of the window, and beyond the gate a figure turned away, the man she had hoped would be the exception. Her heart dropped like a spoon slipping from a tired hand. In her silence, Adeora felt the weight of another almost settling on her chest, heavy like soaked wool. Evenings in their home were marked by routine. Greg would sit on the veranda, sipping from his favorite mug with the chipped rim, his eyes scanning the compound as if daring trouble to try him. Jemima, his soft-spoken wife, moved around like a gentle breeze, never too loud, never in the way. Adeora admired her patience, though she often wondered if Jemima had folded her dreams and packed them away in the name of peace. Dinner was eaten in a quiet chorus of clinking cutlery and shallow conversation, Greg talking about market prices, Jemima nodding, Adeora chewing slowly like the meal owed her answers. That night was no different, except Adeora's ears rang with the echo of F's disappointment. She hadn't even told Greg that F wanted to propose. There was no point. His disapproval always came wrapped in reasons that sounded logical but felt like shackles. He's too short. His job is not secure. I don't like the way he looked at me. Every man became a suspect, and every love a crime. Her life felt like a locked room with Greg holding the only key, and yet she never asked for release. Years passed like water dripping from a faulty tap, slow, steady, ignored until the bucket overflowed. Adeora watched her mates blossom into wives, mothers, homeowners. She scrolled past wedding photos with a smile stitched across her face like embroidery, delicate but unnatural. Suitors came like seasons, each bringing their own weather. But Greg met them at the door like a storm warning, his tone icy, his gaze cutting. Over time, the knock stopped. The greetings grew shorter. The stares from neighbors became pitying glances. Is it that she's too picky? Maybe she's married spiritually, they whispered under their breaths, tongues clicking in mock concern. Adeora said nothing. Her silence became her armor and her prison. At night, when everyone slept, she'd sit by the window, tracing patterns in the dust on the sill, wondering if love had bypassed her address or simply been turned away. The moon, high and indifferent, offered no answers, just light, cold, distant light. Greg believed he was doing God's work, guarding his sister like a shepherd would a lamb, even if it meant keeping her fenced in. He wore his protectiveness like a badge, not realizing it had become a burden she could no longer carry. Jemima saw it too, though she rarely spoke. Once, in the thick of a rainy evening, when thunder cracked the sky like an angry whip, she slipped into Adeora's room with a tray of pepper soup and eyes that said more than her lips dared. "You're still young," she murmured, placing the tray down. "But youth doesn't wait forever." Adeora nodded, but inside her, something shifted, a quiet rebellion, like a flame flickering in a breeze, not strong enough to light a fire, but stubborn enough not to die. She began to write in a notebook, late at night, spilling thoughts she couldn't voice aloud. "I'm not clay," she wrote once. "Why must I always be molded?" The ink bled through the page, just as her soul bled through the seams of her daily silence. And yet she stayed. For now. The house carried a silence that wasn't born of peace, but of words left unsaid. Adeora moved through its corridors like someone tiptoeing through an old memory, careful not to wake the past. Greg still ruled the compound with invisible reins, and though he never raised his hand, his presence was like a shadow that loomed over everything she did. Every time her phone rang and a male voice spoke on the other end, she found herself turning the volume down, as if affection was a secret crime. There was a man now, Madhu, a friend from her tailoring class, who had begun checking in more often. He wasn't flashy or poetic, but his voice had a kindness that filled the cracks of her long dormant longing. Once, after class, he offered to walk her home. She declined, not because she didn't want to, but because she could already picture the frown Greg would wear like a judge's robe. She arrived home that day carrying more than her bag. She carried a question that wouldn't leave her alone. At what point does loyalty become self-betrayal? In the kitchen, as she washed plates, Jemima came in to dry. There was something in Jemima's sigh, a quiet rebellion folded neatly into the rhythm of routine. She didn't speak much, but in the way she looked at Adeora, it was clear she knew. And in her knowing, Adeora felt seen for the first time in years. It was a Saturday morning soaked in golden sun and idle gossip from the nearby tailoring shop when Madhu appeared at the gate again, this time holding a small nylon bag of zobo and chin-chin. Greg wasn't around. The air felt different, looser, like an unbuttoned collar on a humid day. Adeora welcomed him in cautiously, her fingers trembling slightly as she poured water into a cup. They sat in the veranda speaking about small things, thread counts, fabric choices, favorite colors. Yet underneath the laughter and sips of zobo, there was something brewing, an unspoken audition for a future neither of them could fully describe. When Greg returned, he met them mid-laughter. The sound died faster than a candle in the wind. Madhu stood up, respectful, courteous, but Greg's eyes scanned him like a customs officer checking a suspicious bag. "Next time, call before you come," he said stiffly, not raising his voice but slicing with his tone. Madhu nodded, apologized, and left. Later that night, Greg knocked on Adeora's door and spoke without preamble. "Don't let that one start having ideas." "He doesn't look serious." Adeora didn't respond. She just nodded, her lips pressed into a line so thin it could have been drawn with a ruler. When he left, she sat on the edge of her bed, hands folded on her lap like a child in a scolding. But inside, her spirit was pacing, agitated, itching, hungry. She was tired of being told how much love she could afford. The weeks that followed became a seesaw of hope and disappointment. Madhu continued to text, warm messages in the morning, light-hearted jokes at night, but he stopped coming by. He was no fool. He could read the room, and that room had Greg's name written all over the walls. Adeora noticed the change, and though she tried not to take it personally, she knew what was happening. She had become a painting admired from afar, but too protected to be touched. One evening, she ran into an old classmate at the market, Ngozi, now married with 2 toddlers. Ngozi's face lit up when she saw her, but her next sentence stung like cold water. "You still date Greg House?" "Ah, that man too chase all your husbands." It wasn't said with malice, but the truth always found a way to hurt, even when offered gently. Adeora smiled politely and walked away, but that sentence sat with her like a heavy guest. At home, she prepared okra soup with trembling hands. Jemima entered the kitchen and saw the unshed tears brimming in her sister-in-law's eyes. Without a word, she touched Adeora's shoulder and squeezed. It was the first time Adeora allowed herself to cry in front of anyone since her mother died. The tears came fast, not from pain, but from the pressure of years packed tightly into a smile that no longer fit. In the quiet days that followed, Adaora began to write more. She filled 3 new pages in her notebook with thoughts that felt like thunder trapped in her chest. She wrote about her dreams, not wild ones, just small ones, like walking freely with someone who loved her, like choosing her own earrings without wondering if they were too loud, too not Adaora. She wrote about how Greg had become both her anchor and her chain, how she lived like a tenant in her own story, renting space but never truly owning her path. One afternoon, Jemima entered her room without knocking, holding a small leather purse. She handed it to Adaora. "Take," she said simply. Inside was 15,000 naira. "If you want to meet that boy, go and eat together. You don't have to explain to anyone." Adaora stared, stunned. The money wasn't much, but it felt like the first slice of freedom she had tasted in years. She stood there, blinking, unsure if she should hug her or question her. But Jemima only smiled and added, "Don't let your life become a window you watch the world through." That evening, Adaora dressed up in a simple gown and told Greg she was going to visit a church friend. She didn't lie, not fully. She was just protecting a version of herself that was finally learning to breathe. The day Adaora stepped into the small eatery tucked behind the carpenter's shed on Okizi Street, it was as though the world had slowed just enough to allow her a glimpse of something gentle. Madu was already seated, a white plastic cup in front of him half full with chilled sobo, and a faint smile playing on his lips when he saw her. The greeting was simple, unforced, 2 people who had waited long enough to recognize the value of quiet moments. She wore a mustard-yellow dress, the hem brushing just above her ankles, with a thin scarf draped loosely around her neck. It wasn't much, but to her, it felt like stepping into her own skin. They talked as though nothing had ever been broken between them, about market hikes, the woman who fell off a bike by the roundabout, the neighbor whose goat had gone missing. Beneath the laughter, though, lay a layer of tenderness that neither of them dared press too hard, as if love, in its fragile newness, could shatter like porcelain. Adaora kept checking her phone, not for messages, but for time. She didn't want to be missed. She didn't want questions. When the meal ended, Madu offered to walk her back, but she declined. "Next time," she whispered, unsure if she meant it or was simply afraid to risk another precious thing being stolen by the man who called himself her protector. That night, the sky wept in scattered droplets, drumming lightly against the corrugated roofing, like a timid knock. Greg had already retired to the sitting room, his reading glasses perched at the tip of his nose, a stack of unopened bills fanned out before him, like playing cards, waiting for fate. Adaora moved about the house with careful ease, her steps measured like someone hiding joy under their soles. Jemima watched her from the kitchen doorway, a small curl of amusement at the corners of her mouth. There was something different about Adaora tonight, the way she hummed while rinsing her cup, the slight sway in her hips as she returned her scarf to the drawer. But it was the light in her eyes that betrayed her the most, like sunlight slipping through closed blinds. Greg, ever alert to tremors, looked up as Adaora passed him. "Where did you say you went again?" he asked, the words not angry, but heavy, like a boot pressing gently on a tender bruise. "Sister Chiyoma's place," she replied smoothly, heart racing behind her ribs. He nodded slowly, then returned to his papers, though his eyes no longer moved across the text. That night, Adaora lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, not because she couldn't sleep, but because a part of her was afraid that waking up would return her to the old script she was finally rewriting. The days that followed were drenched in small defiance. Adaora began going out more, sometimes with Jemima's help, sometimes with her own quiet willpower. She didn't announce her steps, she simply took them. Greg noticed. He didn't always say something, but his silence carried a bite that grew sharper with each passing day. His questions became laced with suspicion. Why so many new fabrics? "You're sewing for a client or yourself?" He hadn't yet connected the dots, but he was circling the picture like a vulture, unsure if the body below was sleeping or gone. One Sunday afternoon, while she was airing her wrapper outside, a distant cousin came visiting, Ngozi's younger sister, Amara, who had recently gotten married. "Still single, Edaora?" she asked, eyes wide with innocent venom. Edaora smiled, but something inside her tensed. Greg chuckled and said, "She's taking her time. Not every rush ends in peace." That moment sat with Edaora like bitter cola. Later, alone in the kitchen, she stared at the pot of stew simmering gently and whispered, "Even peace shouldn't come at the cost of a locked heart." She didn't cry. She had done enough of that. What she felt was something else, like dry soil finally cracking open beneath the pressure of something trying to bloom. When the call came from Madhu that he was leaving for Hawaii for a short contract, it felt like both a threat and a test. They had grown closer in small ways, shared jokes, light texts, a few brief hand touches exchanged like contraband, but no declaration had been made. No promise. "I just wanted to see if," he had said, pausing as though scared his voice might betray him. "I just wanted to see if you saw us too." Edaora didn't know what to say. She wanted to scream yes. She wanted to whisper maybe. Instead, she said, "Have a safe journey," and ended the call with her heart still full and her voice emptied. That evening, the power went out, and the house fell into that familiar kind of darkness where even thoughts seem louder than footsteps. Greg paced the corridor like a sentry, and when he passed her door, she heard him pause. "You've been moving differently," he said through the wood, not unkindly. "Is there something I should know?" Edaora didn't answer. She didn't even breathe. She just lay still, hand over her heart, as if trying to muffle the sound of change rising in her chest. Outside, the wind swept dry leaves across the compound, and the moon slipped behind the clouds like a secret waiting for daylight to break. Rain had not fallen in days, yet the air hung thick like wrung-out cloth, heavy with heat and tension. Edaora stood by the window in her room, the curtain bunched in one hand, the other resting on her hip as she watched the sky change color from a sleepy gray to something deeper, something almost resentful. She hadn't heard from Madhu since he arrived in Hawaii, not a message, not even a missed call. But it wasn't the silence that worried her, it was how quickly she had grown used to waiting. Waiting had become her second skin, stitched across her years like a tailor's practice cloth, patched, stretched, worn. Greg had resumed his full presence in the house again, calling her for every errand, critiquing her decisions, commenting on her stitching, her silence, even the way she folded her wrappers. "You're becoming too quiet," he remarked one morning, sipping pap through a cracked plastic cup. "Hope nothing is eating you from the inside." Edaora gave him a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, and turned away before he could read too much into her stillness. But inside, she was a pot left on fire too long, boiling steadily, slowly losing water, softening until only the burn was left. The real shift began on a Tuesday, when Jemima found Edaora asleep on the veranda chair, with her Bible open on her lap, and a half-sewn blouse still pinned to her thighs. The sun had started to slide behind the clouds, drawing long shadows across the compound, and Jemima's footsteps made only the faintest creak as she approached. She didn't wake her immediately. Instead, she looked at her sister-in-law's face, the slight twitch of her eyelid, the crease between her brows, the faint pursing of her lips even in rest. Edaora had always been a careful girl, the kind who rinsed rice 3 times and folded her wrappers at dusk. But lately, Jemima noticed how often she left her hair uncombed, her journals half open, her voice trailing off mid-sentence like a page torn from a book and forgotten. That evening, after Edaora woke up and stretched her limbs like someone whose dreams had been too tight, Jemima placed a bowl of akba in front of her. "Eat, then come to my room," she said gently, with no urgency, but a weight in her voice that made Edaora nod before she even knew why. In the room lit by a single rechargeable lamp, Jemima closed the door and exhaled. "You love him, don't you?" she asked, not in accusation, but in recognition. Edaora blinked, her throat suddenly dry. "I don't know," she whispered, but both women knew that was not the truth. That night, the house was wrapped in the kind of silence that made the tick of the wall clock sound like a knock on one's conscience. Greg was in the living room again, his eyes flicking through the news headlines on his phone, his glasses perched low, the same pair he had refused to change even though the left lens had a tiny crack. Adara passed behind him, her wrapper swaying, and as if sensing her, he cleared his throat. "You've been in Jemima's room a lot lately," he said, not looking up. "If there's something going on, I hope you're telling the right people." Adeora stopped. It wasn't what he said that caught her, but the way he said it, measured, as if preempting a secret. She looked at him, really looked. The man who had raised her since their parents passed, the man who used to lift her on his shoulders to pick mangoes, who once rode across town just to chase off a boy who made her cry. But somewhere between then and now, Greg had become something else. Still her brother, yes, but also her warden, her filter, her final say. "You think you're helping," she said, voice barely above a breath, "but you've been choosing fear for me and calling it love." Greg's face stiffened, the line of his jaw tightening. He didn't respond, and she didn't wait for one. She walked away with her heart pounding, each step peeling away a layer of the silence that had coated her life like varnish over old wood. The following week unfolded like a fever dream, hot, slow, and filled with too much thinking. Adeora kept herself busy at the sewing table, but even the whir of the machine couldn't drown out the thrum in her chest. She wanted answers, wanted clarity, but all she had was the echo of Jemima's voice repeating, "Love isn't supposed to feel like begging to breathe." She began writing again, this time not in her notebook, but in letters she never planned to send. One was addressed to Madhu, full of half-finished thoughts and too many rewrites. The other was to herself, scrawled in hurried cursive on the back of an old calendar sheet. It read, "I let him draw the map of my life, and now I'm lost somewhere between his idea of safety and my longing for freedom." That evening, Greg received a phone call from a friend in Owari, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Adeora didn't catch the full details, but she heard the words contractor and Madhu, and the shift in her brother's tone, a tightening, a hardening, followed by silence. Later that night, he stood in front of her room and spoke through the closed door. "These things, they don't always end well." But Adeora no longer heard warnings in his words. She heard fear. Not hers, but his. And that made all the difference. In the stillness of that hour, beneath a quiet sky and the hum of mosquitoes, Adeora whispered a vow to herself, not out loud, not for anyone else to hear, but deeply, like a seed buried in earth. She would choose her own ending, whether or not it came with applause. The sun was already leaning westward by the time Adeora finished folding the last wrapper on the line. The cloth smelled of soap and wind, two small symbols of a life that was gradually taking on a new scent. As she turned to go inside, her eyes caught movement at the gate. It creaked open, not with the usual force of a man arriving in command, but cautiously, like someone uncertain of what they would find on the other side. Greg stepped in, his shoes dusted from the roadside, shirt clinging to his back in creases that hinted at a long, restless day. Adeora greeted him quietly. He nodded, and for a second, their eyes held each other, an unspoken acknowledgment of the shift that had widened between them like a crack in dry earth. He didn't ask where she had been or who had walked her home, but something in the way he dropped his keys into the bowl by the shoe rack told her he already knew. That night, the house sat in a silence that wasn't empty, but charged like clouds before a storm that may or may not break. Jemima served dinner in silence, her face unreadable, but her movements deliberate. When Greg sat across from Adeora at the table, he didn't start with small talk. Instead, he cleared his throat, looked her squarely in the face, and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want the truth. Are you planning to marry that man?" Her spoon hovered over her bowl, dripping slowly, as she met his gaze with one of her own, calm, unmoving, unafraid. It was the first time in years that Greg asked a question he genuinely wanted answered, not for the sake of control, not to assert dominance, but because uncertainty had finally knocked on the gates of his certainty. Adeora placed the spoon back on her plate and wiped her mouth with the corner of her wrapper, not out of decorum, but as a way to give herself a few more seconds of calm. "I don't know yet," she said, her voice steady as rain falling on a zinc roof. "But I do know that I want the chance to find out with asking your permission." Greg's fingers clenched slightly around his fork, then relaxed. "And if he's not good for you? If he breaks you?" She tilted her head slightly. "Then I'll mend myself, just like every other woman who's had to stitch her own heart back together." The words didn't come from a place of rebellion. They came from truth's kitchen, slowly boiled, well seasoned with years of waiting, disappointment, and growth. Jemima didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. She reached out and held Adeora's hand under the table, a quiet signal that this moment belonged to her. Greg stood, not in anger, but in a kind of grief that often visits men who wake up too late to the lives they've shaped. "You think I don't love you," he whispered, almost to himself. Adeora stood too, not raising her voice, not sharpening her tone. "I think you loved me with fear instead of faith. And I carried that fear like a second skin until it became too heavy to wear." She walked out of the dining room then, leaving her half-finished meal and the echoes of a conversation that had waited too long to be born. The following day passed in a strange, almost sacred quiet. Adeora spent the morning stitching a blouse for a client's wedding, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone who no longer second-guessed her every decision. She no longer peered through windows when a knock came to the gate. She answered it herself. And when Madhu arrived that afternoon, unannounced, holding 2 bottles of malt and a small paper bag of fried meat, she welcomed him without hesitation. They sat beneath the mango tree again, the same one where she once journaled her regrets. This time, there were no regrets on the page. Just lists, fabrics to buy, clients to call, dreams to shape. Madhu listened quietly as she spoke about possibly moving her tailoring into a shared shop space in town. He smiled, impressed, but not surprised. "I always knew you had your own rhythm," he said. "You just needed your own drum." They didn't talk about love that day, or marriage. It wasn't avoidance, it was patience. 2 people watering a thing slowly, refusing to pluck it before it bloomed. When he stood to leave, he hesitated. "When you're ready, I'll still be here," he said, not as a plea, but as a promise spoken with both feet planted on solid ground. Adeora nodded. "When I'm ready, I'll come not as someone asking to be rescued, but as someone choosing to walk beside you." And with that, he left. Her heart, once a tight knot of longing and confusion, now beat with the rhythm of a woman who had finally stepped into her own weather. As evening crept in, the house took on the golden hush of approaching dusk. Adeora sat beside Jemima in the corridor, peeling a goosey and occasionally pausing to stretch her back. Greg passed by twice, heading toward the borehole, then to the store. He didn't speak, but his steps had lost their old authority. It was the quiet pace of a man rethinking his footsteps. Adeora watched him without resentment. She understood now that his overprotection had never come from cruelty. It had come from a boy who grew into a man too fast, who had been handed the role of father, mother, gatekeeper, and guide, all in one breath. He had clutched her life like a precious jar he was afraid to let anyone else carry. And though his grip had hurt her, she saw him now with eyes softened by perspective. "Will you ever forgive him?" Jemima asked, not turning her head. Adeora exhaled, not in anger, but in release. "I already have," she replied. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I'll give him back the steering wheel." Inside the kitchen, water began to boil, and a bird outside let out a long, sorrowful note before flying away. That night, as Adeora climbed into bed, she didn't reach for her journal. She didn't have to. Her life had already begun to write itself in the language of freedom. The final market week before the new month came with a kind of bustle that reminded Aotearoa of how life always moved, whether you were ready or not. Traders bickered over pepper prices, Okada riders swerved through tight spaces like boys playing a game of dare, and wrappers in wild floral prints flapped in the breeze like flags of everyday survival. Aotearoa walked through the open stalls with her basket balanced in the crook of her elbow, mentally ticking off items from her list: onions, crayfish, thread, and a new zipper for Mama Oguchi's lace skirt. But beneath the focus lay a quiet awareness that everything had shifted. Not in loud, explosive ways, but in the soft unfolding of choices made, conversations braved, and walls gently dismantled. She now moved through the world like someone no longer asking to be accepted, but simply living. When she paused by the cobbler's stand to greet a familiar face, she noticed two women whispering a short distance away. One of them pointed discreetly toward her, then leaned in to say something that made the other chuckle behind her palm. Aotearoa didn't flinch. She had grown past the sting of hushed gossip. Let them say what they would. She had learned that a woman's peace often made others uncomfortable, especially when it wasn't tied to a ring or a man's approval. She adjusted her headscarf, thanked the cobbler for fixing her old sandals, and walked on, not with arrogance, but with the grace of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for her pace. Back at home, the compound carried the midday heat like a thick blanket wrapped too tightly. Jemima was under the almond tree, shelling groundnuts with the children, their laughter piercing the air in bright, innocent bursts. Aotearoa joined them briefly, crouching to help separate husks from the tiny golden gems inside. One of the children asked if she was getting married soon, and the question, innocent and bare, hung in the air longer than it should have. She smiled and gave the only answer that felt true. Maybe. Maybe not. But I'm happy. It wasn't rehearsed or defensive. Just honest. Greg returned later that afternoon with yam and plantain from the village. He didn't call for her. Instead, he left the sacks at the corridor and sat on the veranda, wiping sweat from his face with a faded handkerchief. Aotearoa saw him from her window. After a few minutes, she stepped out, poured a cup of cold water, and handed it to him without a word. He looked up at her, eyes narrowed against the sun, and took it. For a while, neither of them spoke. It wasn't the awkward silence of estrangement, but the kind of stillness that lives between two people who have hurt each other and are slowly learning how to live beyond it. Greg cleared his throat and said, "You remind me of Mama." Aotearoa raised a brow. Strong-willed? He smiled faintly. And always walking around like the whole sky was in her chest. She laughed, soft and full, the sound brushing against the air like a breeze that had taken too long to arrive. Evening brought with it a soft drizzle that kissed the rooftops and filled the gutters with gentle murmurs. Inside the sitting room, Jemima braided one of the children's hair, while a local radio drama crackled from the shelf. Aotearoa sat nearby, sewing the hem of a blouse, her fingers moving with muscle memory while her mind wandered elsewhere. She thought of Madhu, how he had called that morning, asking if she wanted to go with him to see a property he was thinking of leasing for his new business. She had said yes, not because she was in a hurry to be involved, but because she wanted to understand what building a future together might actually feel like. He wasn't perfect. He didn't always say the right things, and he sometimes let his silences linger too long. But he listened, and he waited, and he made space for her without asking her to shrink. As the rain deepened and thunder rolled gently in the distance, Aotearoa looked up at her brother, who had now joined them, sitting quietly with a book he hadn't opened in weeks. He watched his family, the quiet weaving of moments, the simplicity of presence. She wondered if he felt the peace she did. Not the loud kind that shouted victory, but the small, stable hum that came when life finally aligned with truth. He caught her looking at him and nodded once. It was the most he could give, but it was enough. It didn't have to be anything more. By the time night arrived fully, the compound had returned to its usual rhythm, doors shut, lanterns lit, and conversations trailing into whispers. Adara stood by the back window, gazing at the moon that now hung low and wide like a full promise stretched across the heavens. She breathed deeply, letting the still air fill her lungs and empty her thoughts. There was no grand announcement, no sudden proposal, no dramatic ending. Just her, alive, aware, and finally unafraid to walk paths that were not mapped by someone else's fear. The version of herself that once waited by doors, hoping to be invited into her own future, had slowly, quietly faded. In her place stood a woman who didn't just open those doors. She built new ones. Doors that didn't need Greg's key. She turned away from the window, undid her headscarf, and folded it neatly beside her pillow. Then she lay down, not with a heart pounding in hesitation, but with one that pulsed with peace. Outside, a generator hummed somewhere in the distance. Crickets began their midnight chorus, and as Adeora closed her eyes, she didn't count regrets like she used to. She simply rested, knowing that for the first time in years, she had finally given herself permission to live. Sometimes, love wears the face of protection but holds the weight of possession. Adeora's story reminds us that even silence can be a slow poison when it keeps you from the life you were meant to live. Family can be a covering, yes, but even a roof must allow light in. If you find yourself constantly dimming your voice to maintain peace, or folding your dreams into corners just to be accepted, ask yourself, whose life are you living? There's wisdom in listening, but there is also strength in choosing. Not every no is a red flag. Some are born from fear, not foresight. And not every delay is divine. Some are designed by people who mean well, but do not see your heart's blueprint. Protect your heart, yes, but do not imprison it behind someone else's fear. Learn to weigh advice, but let your spirit lead. At some point, you must become the author of your own journey, no matter who held the pen before. You owe yourself the freedom to bloom where your soul is watered, not just where tradition plants you. Father, we thank you for the quiet strength you plant in the hearts of those who feel unseen. We lift every listener whose dreams have been shelved for too long, every soul who has walked in borrowed shoes, every heart still waiting for permission to live fully. Lord, breathe courage into them. Let them know that obedience to you does not mean silencing their purpose. For every Adeora listening, every person who has lived too long under the shadow of someone else's will, God, send clarity. Pour out healing over the years lost to hesitation, and restore what fear tried to rob. Replace timidity with boldness. Let grace wrap around their choices like a second skin. We ask that you open doors that no man can shut, and if they must walk alone, let them feel you walking beside them. We declare emotional liberty. We pray for wisdom to love our families without losing ourselves. May they rise with the confidence of Esther and the resolve of Ruth, knowing that even when the world misunderstands their yes, heaven is cheering it on. Let this be the season where hidden seeds finally sprout. Let the silence be broken with purpose, and may peace flow like rivers into every dry place. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.